They say the worst thing that can happen to an Omega is to be rejected. They are wrong. Rejection is loud. Rejection is a moment you can point to, a wound with a clear beginning. What happened to Seraphina Voss was something quieter and far more permanent. It was erasure, the slow, deliberate work of being unmade, not with one blow, but with 100 small removals, spread across 5 years, until the day came when she could walk through a room full of people, and not one of them would turn to look. Seraphina has not been looked at in 5 years. Right now she is on her knees on a cold stone floor before dawn, scrubbing, alone in the enormous silence of the Ironmore Pack estate. The building rises around her. High ceilings, carved stone, the smell of cedar and old money. Beautiful the way things are beautiful when they were never built for you. She scrubs in long, even strokes. She does not think. Thinking is a luxury she gave up somewhere around year 2. Then the horn sounds. One long, low note rolling across the frozen grounds from the northern road. Every wolf in the Ironmore Pack knows that sound. They have been waiting 5 years to hear it. The Alpha King is returning home. Seraphina's hands do not stop moving. Something inside her speaks in a voice she built specifically for moments like this. Cold and practical and designed to keep her standing. It says, "He is a king now. You are the girl who sleeps in the servant wing. You were always going to end up here. You knew that. You have always known that." The horn fades. The corridor stays dark. She moves the bucket 3 feet to the left and keeps scrubbing. But here is the thing that voice does not know. Here is what no one in that estate understands. Not his mother, not the council, not even Seraphina herself on her knees in the dark. The king remembers. He has always remembered. And a king who remembers is the most dangerous thing in the world to a woman who was supposed to be forgotten. Seraphina passes the oak tree every morning on her way to the woodshed. Every morning she tells herself she will not look at it. She looks anyway. The carving is still there. Weathered now, soft with years of rain and frost, but clear enough if you know where to find it. 2 sets of initials inside a rough lopsided circle, J-A and S-V. Carved badly, because he was 12 years old and the knife kept slipping, and she had stood behind him saying that looks nothing like a circle, until he turned around with wood shavings in his hair and said, "Then you do it." And she laughed so hard she sat down in the snow. She does not laugh now. She keeps walking. She has somewhere to be. But the memory follows her. They always do this early in the morning before her defenses are fully in place. Before she has reminded herself of everything she is not allowed to feel and everything she gave up the right to want a long time ago. She was 7 years old when they brought her to the estate, small for her age. Hollow-eyed with the grief of a child who does not yet have words for what she has lost. Her parents had died in service to the Ironmore Pack, a border ambush, 2 names added to the wall of honored dead, and their daughter quietly given a cot in the servant wing as a kind of afterthought. No one was cruel to her. No one was particularly kind either. She was simplest, the way you place furniture in a room that never asked for it. She sat in the dark on her first night and did not cry, because she had already learned that crying does not return the things you have lost. That was when the door opened. He was 8 years old, wearing a sleeping robe too big for him, carrying a candle that was doing very little against the dark of the corridor. He stopped when he saw her. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke. Then he walked in and sat down on the floor beside her and stayed. He did not ask her name. He did not say anything reassuring or kind or careful. He just sat in the dark beside her, a small, warm, completely uninvited presence, until she stopped being afraid of the silence. She never entirely recovered from that. Growing up alongside John Ashvale was not what anyone would have designed for her. Omegas did not share lessons with the Alpha heir. They did not wander forests at dusk pointing out constellations, or argue about pack law over stolen bread from the kitchen, or fall asleep in the hayloft, reading the same book from opposite ends. None of that was supposed to happen. It happened anyway, because John found rules interesting, mainly as objects to examine and selectively ignore. And because Seraphina who had arrived with nothing, discovered what she had been given instead: his company, his attention, his total and genuine awareness of her as a person who existed in the world and mattered in it. She had not had that before. She did not know how to protect herself from it. She understood what it meant when she was 16, not with drama or a sudden revelation, with the quiet certainty of recognizing something that had always been true. John had brought her tea that morning, made badly because he had insisted on doing it himself, and when he handed her the cup, he watched her face with that expression he always had, waiting, almost nervous, the expression of someone for whom her reaction was the entire point of the exercise. She looked at him across the tea and thought, "Oh, it is you, it has always been you." She never said it out loud. She understood, even then, what she was and what he was. She was an Omega ward with no bloodline and no title. He was the heir to the Ironmore Alpha seat, being prepared from birth for a crown that required everything and left nothing to chance. She loved him anyway, quietly and completely, with the discipline of someone who understood that some things, once spoken aloud, become weapons in other people's hands. Young Dorian used to watch them from doorways, 2 years younger than John, quitter and more careful. With their mother's eyes and a mind that missed very little, he never interrupted. He never reported back, or if he did, Seraphina never saw the consequences. He simply watched with an expression she could not fully read, and she told herself it was just a younger brother wanting to be included. She understands now what Dorian's was watching for. She has had 5 years to figure it out, and Maris watched from windows. Always from a distance, never close enough to be confronted, never far enough to be dismissed. Seraphina caught her once, looking down from the upper gallery at the two of them racing in the first snow of winter. John had won, barely, and turned around laughing. Seraphina looked up by instinct and found Maris's eyes already on her. Maris did not look angry. She looked calm, patient, like a woman who has identified a problem and is deciding the most efficient way to solve it. Seraphina was 15. She filed the look away. She understands it now. The last night lives in her body more than her mind. The herb garden at midnight. The two of them standing close in the way they never discussed and never stopped doing. The smell of rosemary. The sound of his voice dropping to the register it only ever reached when no one else was around. He said, "I will come back, and when I do, everything is going to be different." She believed him. She was 19 years old, and she believed every word with everything she had, because he had never once given her a reason not to. She reaches the woodshed now. She picks up the axe. She does not think about what she believed at 19, but as she raises it, she hears the horn again. Closer this time, carried on the morning wind from the northern road. And beneath it, rising slowly through the frozen ground and up through the soles of her worn boots, a vibration she recognizes before her mind can catch up. Hoofbeats, dozens of them, coming home. Something moves inside her, in a place she sealed shut 5 years ago and has not opened since. Something that heard that horn and recognized it the way the earth recognizes spring. Not because it was expected, but because the recognition was always going to be there, regardless of how long the winter lasted. She brings the axe down hard. The wood splits clean. She does not look toward the northern road. She does not look. She will not look. From inside the estate, rising through the stone walls and the cedar-scented air and 5 years of careful distance, comes the sound of the great doors opening, and then a voice. Familiar as her own name. Older now, deeper, shaped by years she was not there for, but unmistakable, impossible, ruinous, his. The thing she sealed shut 5 years ago does not crack. It does not gradually loosen or slowly soften, it shatters. The first thing Maris took was her title, not dramatically, not with a speech or a confrontation. Seraphina arrived at the household steward's office 8 days after John's departure to collect her weekly stipend, and the steward looked at his ledger and then looked at her and said, with genuine confusion, that her name did not appear to be listed in the current register. He was not unkind about it. That was the thing about everything Maris did. It was never unkind, it was simply administrative. Week 3, the correction was filed. The name Seraphina Voss appeared in the updated records under a new column. General servants, third tier. Below the kitchen staff, she stared at it for a long time in the steward's office. She did not argue. She already understood that arguing was exactly what she was supposed to do. A scene would be documented. A scene would become a pattern. A pattern would become grounds for something worse. She signed the form and went back to work. The meals came next, reduced to standard servant rations, smaller portions, plainer food, no explanation given because none was required. Then came the room. Her familiar space with a window overlooking the herb garden, quietly reassigned to a noble beta from the western branch of the pack. Her belongings moved to the servant wing while she was working, so that she returned one evening to find strangers' things where hers had been. Then came the tasks, the ones no one witnessed. The east corridor before dawn, the ash grates after midnight, the work that left her hands cracked and her back a constant low ache she eventually stopped noticing. Each removal came with its own paperwork, its own quiet justification, its own thin veneer of administrative necessity that was almost impossible to challenge without sounding like a woman who had lost perspective. By year 2, she had developed a specific skill she had not known she was building: the ability to move through a room full of people and generate no reaction at all. She told herself it was protection. She was right. She was also, without knowing it, doing Maris's work for her. What Seraphina could not see was what was being built 2 floors above her in the family dining room. Dorian was 17 when John left, quiet and thoughtful, genuinely kind. He loved his brother with a straightforward, uncomplicated intensity. And he had always cared for Seraphina too, in the way of someone who had watched something long enough to understand its value even when no one else was naming it. Maris understood that. She began with what Dorian already believed. The dinner conversations were gentle, almost philosophical, questions about what it meant to protect someone you loved from their own blind spots. What it meant to want better for a person than what they would choose for themselves in a moment of feeling. Dorian engaged with all of it earnestly, and with genuine love for his brother. He did not know he was being walked somewhere specific. He thought he was learning. By year 2, he had arrived, completely on his own, at the firm belief that John's attachment to Seraphina was the one vulnerability that could unravel everything his brother was going to build. He did not know his mother had put that thought there. Lyra arrived in month 3. A beta servant assigned to the linen stores, 2 years older than Seraphina, with the face that people consistently underestimated because it was usually doing something cheerful while her eyes were doing something else entirely. She attached herself to Seraphina with the calm determination of someone completing an obvious task and never detached. She was the one who left extra bread outside Seraphina's door when the servant portions ran short. The one who sat in the herb garden on winter evenings and said terrible, accurate things about the estate's nobility until Seraphina had to press her hand over her mouth to avoid laughing loud enough to be heard. She was the one who, when Seraphina said, "I am fine," in the voice that meant she absolutely was not fine, looked at her and said, "You look like a woman who is one bad Tuesday away from feral," and then stayed until the truth came out. Lyra was also, by year 3, watching Dorian with narrowed eyes. Seraphina noticed but never asked what she was thinking. She would wish later that she had. On the last morning, the morning before the horn, before the hoofbeats, before everything, Seraphina stood at the estate gate in the blue-gray hour before dawn with a small canvas bag at her feet. She had not planned it consciously. She had simply woken before dawn, as she always did, and found her hands packing with focused, mechanical efficiency. A change of clothes, her mother's ring, a bundle of dried herbs, nothing else because nothing else was truly hers. The road beyond the gate went south. The neutral territories were 3 days' walk. She had survived harder things than 3 days' walk. She stood there for a long time, the bag at her feet, the road ahead. The estate at her back, enormous and different, and so deeply familiar, that leaving it would be like removing something structural from herself. Then she picked up the bag, carried it back inside the gate, walked to the east corridor and her bucket, and the cold stone floor, and the work that started before the world woke up. She did not fully understand why she stayed. The audience does. The formal announcement came on a Tuesday. Lyra appeared at the garden gate with the expression she reserved for information that required sitting down first. Seraphina did not sit down. Lyra told her anyway. The betrothal sentence was in 4 days. Lady Isolde of Stormhaven would arrive for the pre-ceremony dinner that evening. The council had ratified the timeline that morning, in a session John had attended and had not stopped, which meant either he had a plan Seraphina didn't know about, or the wall Maris had built around the political contract was finally complete. Seraphina kept replanting the winter sage. Her hands kept moving, because stopping them would have meant acknowledging the collapse happening in her chest, and she did not have time for that before nightfall. Lyra sat on the garden wall and watched her. After a long silence, she said, "The dinner is formal. You will not be expected to attend." A pause. Maris made certain of that specifically. Seraphina pressed the sage into the soil and said nothing. Lady Isolde arrived as the evening light turned the courtyard stones amber. Seraphina watched from the upper corridor window. She had expected someone cold. Someone sharp and ambitious, a woman who had negotiated herself into a crown and wore that knowledge visibly. What came through the gate, it said, was quieter than that. Fine-featured, composed, moving through the formal reception with the careful grace of someone who had learned to occupy exactly the right amount of space in rooms arranged without her input. She greeted Maris with precise courtesy. She greeted Dorian with genuine warmth. She sat at the dinner table and conducted herself with flawless, exhausting composure. And every time a door opened, she watched John's eyes move to it. Not obviously. Not in a way the council would notice. But Lady Isolde was not the council. She was watching the room. She saw it the first time and noted it. The third time she understood it. By the fifth time, her expression had settled into something that looked almost like resignation and almost like relief. After dinner, she found John in the corridor and did not waste words. She said, "I want to be clear before this goes any further. I made a practical agreement, and I have honored the terms of my travel. But I did not come 4 days north to be a consolation prize for a man who is already claimed by someone else." She looked at him steadily. "Every time that door opened tonight, you looked for her. I counted. You should know that." John said nothing for a moment. She said, "I am not asking for an apology. I am telling you I will not participate in a ceremony that would be a lie from the first word. Whatever you decide to do about the treaty is your business and your mother's, but I will not be used to seal it." She paused. "I hope she is worth it. From what I saw tonight, I think she probably is." She walked back to the guest wing with the straight-backed composure of a woman who had made a decision that cost her something and had no intention of showing it in a corridor. John stood alone and understood with complete clarity that there was no version of this where he kept everything. He had been looking for a clever solution. Lady Isolde had just quietly closed that door. There was no middle ground. There never had been. Dorian went to the herb garden at dusk. He found Seraphina on the stone bench and sat beside her in the way he had done 100 times growing up. Familiar enough to be comfortable, careful enough not to presume. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and it almost felt like before. Then he said, "I need to talk to you about my brother." She had known it was coming. She sat still and let him speak, because refusing to hear it would have felt like cowardice, and she had survived too much to be a coward now. He did not threaten her, did not raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet, careful pain of someone delivering a diagnosis they wish they did not have to give. He said, "You know what kind of man he is. You know he will not stop. He will give up the crown, the treaty, the peace that hundreds of people died for, and he will do it without flinching and never once ask you to stop him." He looked at her. If you love him the way I believe you do, you already know what the right thing is. He stood up, put his hand briefly on her shoulder, said, I am sorry, I mean that. Then he walked back to the estate and left her alone with the rosemary and the dying light, and the thing he had placed between her ribs that she could not remove. Because he was not wrong about the facts. That was the unbearable part. The peace was real, the cost was real. The kind of man John was, who would spend himself completely without asking her permission, was real. She loved that about him. And it was exactly what was going to destroy him if she stayed. She could argue against Maris. She could argue against the council. She could not argue against her own deepest wound, which Dorian had found with the accuracy of someone who had been watching her for 20 years. The wound that said, the people you love always pay for the space you take up. The kindest thing you can do is take up less. She went inside. She found the canvas bag. She began to pack. She sat on the edge of her cot at midnight with the packed bag at her feet, waiting for dawn. She was not going to be driven out. She was choosing to leave. That felt like the only form of dignity she had left, and she was going to hold it with both hands. Lyra opened the door without knocking, because Lyra had never knocked in the entire duration of their friendship. She stopped when she saw the bag. She came inside. She sat down on the cot beside Seraphina and said nothing for long enough that the silence became its own kind of statement. Then she said, you have spent 5 years disappearing for other people's comfort. Reassigned, renamed, removed, reduced. Every single time you made yourself smaller so someone else would not have to be uncomfortable. And now you are sitting here with a packed bag at midnight about to do it one final time and call it a choice. She turned and looked directly at Seraphina. If you walk out that gate tonight, you are not protecting him. You are finishing what Maris started. The only difference is you are holding the pen. Seraphina stared at the bag. Her jaw was tight. Lyra said, I am going to ask you something and I need the real answer. Not the answer that sounds noble. Not the answer that protects someone else. The real one. She paused. You are allowed to want things. Did you know that? You are actually allowed. So say it out loud. What do you want? The room was very quiet. The fire had burned down to the last of the coals. Outside the estate was dark and still. Somewhere in the east wing John was looking for her. In the council chamber, the backup clause of the treaty was already being drafted. In the morning, the world was going to close around her like a fist, regardless of whether she was inside or outside the gate. Seraphina looked at the bag. She thought about the oak tree. The initials in the bark. The boy who sat in the dark beside her without a word and stayed until she stopped being afraid. She said what she wanted, quietly, for the first time. In the voice of someone testing whether the truth, finally spoken aloud, would break something. It did not break anything. It just sat in the room, real and solid, the way true things are once they have been released. The bag stayed on the floor. From the corridor outside came the sound of footsteps. She knew them the way she knew the sound of the herb garden in wind, unhurried, deliberate. Moving toward her door with the pace of someone who has finished making a decision and is done looking for alternatives. 3 beats of silence outside the door, then a knock. Lyra stood up, smoothed her apron, walked to the door, said very quietly on her way, whatever he says, let him finish. She opened it. John stood in the doorway. He was not dressed for ceremony or performance. Dark wool, no insignia. The expression of a man who had already done the difficult internal work and had arrived to say the conclusion out loud. He looked at Seraphina across the small room. The bond between them, which had been humming steadily in her chest since the courtyard, shifted into something fuller, louder. A sustained note that filled the space between her ribs and refused to be managed. He said, we need to talk, not here, tomorrow, after I do what I should have done the day I rode through that gate. He looked at her for one long moment, then he said, stay, please. Then he was gone. Lyra closed the door, turned around, said nothing. Seraphina looked at the bag on the floor. She left it there. The council chamber had been arranged with the thoroughness of a woman who understood that presentation was power. The long table was dressed in formal ironmore silver. Candles lit. Documents perfectly aligned. The treaty contract positioned at the center, with the deliberate visibility of something already decided. Every council seat was filled. The senior wolves of the pack lined the walls. Lady Isolde's 3 representatives sat to the right in the composed manner of people who had been told this was a formality and had dressed accordingly. The Stormhaven seal was already pressed into the bottom of the ratification document, waiting only for the Crown's countersignature to become permanent law. Maris sat at the far head of the table in deep charcoal gray. Not silver today. Gray was the color of permanence, of foundations, of things that do not move regardless of what falls around them. Dorian stood to her left, straight-backed, pale in the way of someone who had not slept. His eyes fixed on the middle distance with the expression of a man rehearsing his own composure. The Crown sat on a velvet cushion at the center of the table. Then the doors opened. John walked in alone, no guard, no formal escort, no ceremony. He was dressed simply, dark wool, no insignia, the absence of royal presentation so deliberate it shifted the atmosphere of the room before he reached the center. He walked to the middle of the chamber and stopped. He did not sit down. The council exchanged glances. Maris's expression did not change. Her hands, folded on the table in front of her, stayed perfectly still. Only her eyes moved, tracking her son with the careful attention of someone running calculations at speed. John looked at the room, not just the council, not just his mother, all of them. Every wolf at that table and lining those walls. Everyone who had watched what was done to Seraphina across 5 years and had understood it and said nothing because the woman who built it was too powerful and the personal cost of objecting too high. He looked at all of them, long enough that the silence became its own kind of speech. Then he reached out and picked up the crown. He held it and looked at it, not performing the moment, actually looking, the way you look at something you have carried a long time when you have finally decided to set it down. Then he placed it back on the table. The sound it made was small. It filled the chamber completely. He said, "I want to talk about what a king is for." His voice was steady, not loud, not performed. He said he had spent 5 years learning the answer to that question, in conditions that did not allow for comfortable answers. He had watched men die for it. He had made decisions that cost him sleep and would continue to cost him sleep for the rest of his life. Because that was what the crown required, and he had accepted it without flinching. He said, "I came home from all of that to protect a life worth living." That was always the point underneath the contracts and ceremonies and carefully managed alliances, not the architecture of power. The thing the architecture was supposed to be protecting, a life that meant something, a life that was worth the cost. He paused. "That life is not available in this chamber," he said. "I have spent 4 days looking for a version of this where it is. I am finished looking. There is no such version. I think everyone in this room has known that since the day I rode through the gate." He looked at Maris. He said, "I know what you did. All of it. Not just the register and the rooms and the reduced rations, Dorian. I know what those 5 years of dinner conversations were for, and how carefully they were built, and how well they worked. I know it came from love." He held her gaze. "That is the part I cannot move past, not the cruelty of it, the love of it. Understanding that it all came from love is exactly what makes it unbearable." Maris did not speak, did not move. The composed face remained entirely intact. Only her eyes betrayed anything, and what they showed was not surprise. It was the expression of a woman who had always known this moment was the risk, who had built everything specifically to prevent it, and was now watching it arrive anyway. John turned to Dorian. Dorian looked back with the eyes of someone who had not slept and had stopped caring that it showed. In those eyes was everything anyone would have needed to understand what had happened across 5 years. If they had been paying attention to the right things at the right moments. John said, "You are going to make a better king than I would have. I have believed that for years, and I should have said it before now. Because if I had, it might have been harder for her to use it against me." A pause. Do it differently than she taught you. That is all I am asking. Dorian's jaw worked. He said nothing. His hands at his sides had closed into fists, and he was standing with the absolute stillness of a person managing something arriving faster than composure could handle. John pulled on his riding gloves, slowly, one and then the other. He said, "You won. I want you to understand that clearly. The contract stands. The crown stays. Everything you built is still standing exactly as you designed it." He said, "The only thing you do not have is a son who chose it." He looked at her for one final moment. "I hope that difference matters less to you than you think it will. I genuinely hope that." Then he walked to the chamber doors, opened them himself, and walked through without looking back. The doors swung slowly closed behind him with the soft, final sound of something ending that had been a long time ending. The chamber was completely silent, not the silence of shock. The deeper silence of people who have been holding a collective breath for days and have finally exhaled, sitting now in the altered air of a room from which the central tension has simply walked out. Lady Iseld's senior representative looked at the contract, then the crown, then his colleagues. Maris's hand moved across the table toward Dorian's arm, the familiar gesture. Light touch at the shoulder. The physical language of 5 years of careful dinners and gentle conversations, and everything she had built in the space between a mother's love and a mother's design. Dorian stepped away from it. Not with drama, not with anger, not with a word or any gesture that could be named and analyzed afterward. Just a small, precise shift of weight, 4 inches, perhaps less, that moved his shoulder out of reach before her hand arrived. He did not look at her. He was looking at the crown. He reached out and picked it up. He held it in both hands. His face held everything the story had been building toward, and the room had no framework to interpret, because the room had been watching John and had not been paying sufficient attention to the younger son standing to his mother's left, who had absorbed 5 years of careful shaping, who had spent 4 days running a very quiet, very private calculation about what exactly he had been shaped into. He held the crown. His face showed what was true. It was complicated. It would take longer than this moment to understand. From outside the chamber, in the direction of the herb garden, came the sound of footsteps on stone. John leaving, Maris remained at the head of the table, the contract in front of her, the candles burning. Her son standing 4 inches out of reach with the crown in his hands, and an expression she had not put there and could not read. For the first time in this entire story, Maris Ashvale did not know what happened next. He did not know if she was still there. That was the thing living in his chest as he walked through the estate. Not the crown he had set down, not the chamber full of witnesses he had just left, not the sound of the doors closing behind him. The one uncertainty that mattered. Whether she had stayed, whether Dorian's words in the garden had done what they were designed to do. Whether the bag she had packed at midnight had won the argument no one else had been able to win. He walked through the east corridor. Past the stone floor he had found her scrubbing before dawn on the morning of his return. Past the archway where she had stood with her basket of herbs and tried to disappear before he could see her. The estate was quiet in the way of buildings that have just witnessed something significant and have not yet decided how to absorb it. Staff members looked at him and quickly looked away. Council members in the hallway stopped their conversations as he passed. He did not stop. He did not explain. He was done explaining. He pushed through the side door into the cold morning air and walked toward the herb garden. He made himself breathe evenly. Because the alternative was arriving at an empty garden at a run, and he had decided some time in the last hour that he was finished performing composure for rooms that did not deserve it. But this was different. This was just him and whatever he was about to find, and he wanted to arrive as himself, rather than as someone bracing for impact. He came through the garden gate. She was there, standing at the far end near the winter sage, with her hands in her apron pockets and her braids loose from the night. watching him come toward her the way she always had since they were children, steady and present and entirely, completely herself, not performing relief, not pretending distance, just there. Still standing in the place she had always been, he stopped a few feet away. The space between them held 5 years of deferred conversations and wrong timing, and everything that had been done to keep them apart by people who understood exactly what they were to each other, and had worked very hard to make sure it never became something the world had to acknowledge. He said, "I have nothing to offer you." His voice was steady. He had promised himself it would be. He said, "No title, no estate, no crown. I have a wolf and a name and 5 years of things I should have said before I left and did not." I know that is not a reasonable foundation to ask someone to build a life on. He held her gaze, direct, without management, without the performance of a king or the careful presentation of a man who knows he is being watched. He said, "I am asking anyway." Seraphina looked at him. The silence lasted long enough that he felt it through his whole chest, the bond steady and unhurried between them, as though it had been waiting 20 years for this specific moment and had absolutely no concern about a few more seconds. She looked at him with those dark eyes that had always held more than she allowed herself to show. The eyes of a woman who had compressed entire seasons of feeling into very small spaces because the alternative had never been safe. Then she said, "You absolute idiot." Her voice broke on the last word, not with grief, with the specific release of something held under pressure for a very long time finally being allowed to go. She said, "You have always been enough. That was never once the question. You were always the exact thing I was learning to survive without, and I was getting very good at it. And I would like you to know that is entirely your fault." He crossed the remaining distance. He did not perform the moment. He put his arms around her first, the way he had wanted to since the courtyard, since the bond detonated between them in front of the entire pack, and he had stood there with 5 years of separation and his mother's full architecture between them and done nothing, because there were witnesses and consequences, and he was a king. He held her in the herb garden in the cold morning air, and she put her face against his chest, and the bond settled around them both. Not a dramatic shockwave, not golden light splitting the sky. Just a quiet, permanent settling, the specific quality of something that has been slightly wrong with the world for a very long time being carefully put right. Somewhere beneath the surface of both of them, a pale silver wolf and a dark charcoal one found each other and simply stayed, curled close, still, finished searching. She said into his chest, muffled and completely undignified. "Lyra is going to be insufferable about this," he said. "Lyra is going to be right about this." "There is a difference." She laughed. Small and unguarded, the laugh he had carried in his memory through 5 years of campaign beds and frozen northern nights, always precisely itself, always hers. He pressed his face into her hair and memorized the smell of rosemary and cold air and her, and did not let go. They left before dawn. No ceremony, no announcement, no council notification. 2 people and 2 wolves and a road going south through the neutral territories, chosen not for strategy but for direction. Away, theirs. Lyra was waiting at the estate gate before they reached it. Canvas bag already on her shoulder, expression entirely composed. She had apparently decided somewhere between midnight and dawn that no one had specifically told her she could not come, and that this constituted sufficient permission. John looked at her. She looked back with the eyes that were always doing something different from the face. He said nothing. She fell into step. That was the entirety of the conversation. The road was long and cold and entirely, quietly theirs. 1 year later, the cottage sat at the edge of a forest in the neutral territories in the way of a place that has been lived in rather than decorated. Wood smoke and herb bundles drying from the rafters, and the comfortable, specific disorder of a home built by people who had more important things to do than arrange everything correctly. The herb garden was bigger than the one at the estate. planted in the sprawling, unplanned way of someone who finally had enough space to grow everything she had always wanted to grow. It was not tidy, it was magnificent. John had learned across 12 months of not being a king that he was moderately good with an axe, genuinely skilled at fixing things that broke, and almost entirely unable to sit still for more than 20 minutes. Seraphina had observed this with the calm accuracy of someone who had been watching the condition for 20 years and prescribed the only reasonable treatment. Go run. Come back when you have used some of it. He came back clearer every time. He was learning what he was when the crown was not part of the definition. It turned out to be someone he recognized. Someone smaller and truer and considerably easier to live alongside. Lyra made an unreasonable amount of noise in the kitchen at all hours, and had developed a comprehensive set of opinions about the organization of the dried herb bundles that she delivered without invitation, and that Seraphina ignored entirely. No one would have changed any of it for anything in the world. It was, in all its specific and undramatic particulars, a life real, worn at the edges, completely and irrevocably theirs. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It sat on the small table near the window in the morning light. Seraphina noticed it when she came in from the garden with soil on her hands and rosemary in her hair. She stood at the table and looked at the envelope without picking it up. The handwriting was the thing. She understood it immediately in the way you understand things you have been carrying the possibilities of for a long time. Not Maris's careful architectural script, not Dorian's broad, deliberate print. Both, overlapping at the address. The way two people's handwriting overlaps when they have shared the same pen at the same moment. One beginning, one completing, written together, which meant they had written it together, which meant something had shifted in that palace. Something she had not been told about. Some things that had happened across 12 months of consequence and silence, and the specific private education of getting exactly what you built for, and discovering in the quiet afterward what it had actually cost. The story would not explain what was in that letter, because some things belong to the people they happen to, folded inside an envelope, waiting for the moment the person it was sent to is ready to know. Seraphina looked at it for a long time. Then she went back to the garden. She was not ready today. She might be ready tomorrow. The letter would still be there, patient on the table by the window, carrying whatever Dorian and Maris had found their way to writing together. It would be there tomorrow and the day after and for however long it took. Some things required time. Some things stayed broken. Some things, without announcement or drama, began slowly and stubbornly in their own entirely unscheduled way to heal. She knelt in the herb garden. The dark charcoal wolf, no longer a king's wolf, just hers, just John's, just theirs, padded through the gate and folded himself down beside her with the unhurried certainty of a creature that has found where it belongs and has no intention of being anywhere else. She put her hand on his side. Warm and solid and real, he exhaled and closed his eyes. Inside the cottage, through the open window, she could hear Lyra engaged in a spirited, one-sided argument with the lavender bundles that no one had requested and everyone was going to hear regardless. The morning light came through the gap in the trees at the angle it always did at this hour, finding the garden, finding her. Seraphina Voss was not invisible. She was not a servant, not a ward, not an omega filed in a column that did not reflect what she was. She was not the girl who packed a bag at midnight and almost disappeared for the comfort of people who had already taken enough. She was not the woman who had learned to move through rooms without being seen, who had spent 5 years becoming so skilled at erasure that she had started doing someone else's work for them. She was exactly who she had always been. The girl in the dark who someone chose to sit beside, without explanation, without ceremony, without anything except the simple and absolute decision that this was where he was going to be. This time, no one was taking it from her. She was not waiting for that anymore. She pressed her hands into the cold earth of the herb garden and felt the specific, ordinary, completely irreplaceable weight of a life that belonged to her entirely. And she was home. Thank you for listening. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself holding your breath in that courtyard, or sitting with Seraphina at midnight with the bag at her feet, or watching Dorian step 4 inches away from his mother's hand, then it did what it was built to do. Share it with someone who needs to hear that choosing yourself is not a betrayal of love. Subscribe for the next story. We will be here.